This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, and welcome to our Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment teleconference with Elizabeth Grossman on why the U.S. leaves deadly chemicals on the market. My name is Diana DeFazio, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. CHE Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment. CHE Alaska aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. You can find more information at akaction.org and healthandenvironment.org. From time to time, we stray from the presentation format of these calls, and today we'll be having a conversation with Elizabeth Grossman about the investigation that she and Valerie Brown undertook into why so many harmful chemicals remain unregulated in the United States. Towards the end of the hour, we'll invite questions and comments from all of you. Elizabeth Grossman is a journalist and writer specializing in environmental and science issues. She is the author of Chasing Molecules, Poisonous Products, Human Health, and the Promise of Green Chemistry, which received the Gold Nautilus Award for Investigative Reporting. She is also the author of High-Tech Trash, Digital Devices, Hidden Toxics, and Human Health, Watershed, The Undamming of America, and Adventuring Along the Lewis and Clark Trail. And she is co-editor of Shadowcat, Encountering the American Mountain Lion. Her work has appeared in numerous publications, including Scientific American, National Geographic News, Yale E360, Environmental Health Perspectives, Environmental Health News, Civil Eats, The Guardian, In These Times, TheAtlantic.com, Al Jazeera America, Chemical Watch, The Washington Post, Salon, Mother Jones, The Nation, The Pump Handle, Earth Island Journal, Inside Climate News, Yes Magazine, The Huffington Post, and Grist. And hopefully you've all had a chance to follow the link to her article on which this call is based. So welcome, Lizzie. We're so happy you could join us today. And to begin, I wondered if you can tell us a little bit more about your interest in environmental health and why you've devoted your career to writing about related science and policy issues.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thanks to everybody at Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment for inviting me back to talk to you guys again, and also for that embarrassing introduction. Now it's a lesson: don't list everything on your bio because somebody will read it. Why have I done this? I have always been fascinated by science, going back to when I was a kid. And when I started reporting and thinking about what I'd write about as a journalist, which actually coincided with when I moved to Portland, Oregon, and really got to know the Pacific Northwest, someplace where environmental issues are everyday backyard issues in a way that I hadn't been 100% aware of them previously. I mean, they are everywhere, I now realize, but that sort of jolted me awake. And I realized I am absolutely fascinated by the way in which human beings have affected their surrounding environment and also just simply how the natural world works. I also have always been interested in politics and policy, and the combination of writing about both how things work, what happens when human beings impact the environment, and then also thinking about when there are problems, how we fix them. That's where the policy comes in. And I am a freelancer, so that means I'm not on staff, but I have to confess I really like reporting on breaking news as well as these longer investigative projects that I've done in books and that Valerie and I did in this story. But that combination of writing about how people are trying to address these problems as well as describing how the natural world works is kind of at the intersection of why I'm so fascinated about these issues and why I find it so amazing to get to write about them.
Well, like I said before, I hope that people have had a chance to read your article because much of our conversation will center on the content in it, which is obviously an outgrowth of your interest in environmental health and the link with policy. Many people here in the U.S. assume that if a product is sold in our stores, then it must be safe, and they're really surprised to learn that this is not necessarily the case. Your investigation with Valerie Brown into why the U.S. leaves deadly chemicals on the market goes a long way in explaining where we are today and how it is that chemicals known to be harmful to human health remain largely unregulated in our country. You talk about two camps of scientists: regulatory toxicologists and health effects researchers. And I'm wondering, can you discuss the difference in the way these two kinds of scientists study the effects of chemical exposures in humans?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I'll do to introduce that idea is to just say a tiny bit about how it was that we came to do this story, because I think that goes a long way to starting to answer that question. And both of us, both Valerie and I, separately, and then we were talking and realized we'd been following sort of parallel tracks in what we were really curious about, so joined forces, had become really, really curious, as I'm sure lots of the folks working with Alaska Che also have been scratching their heads about, is why it seems that there are two streams of science studies about the same chemicals. We all know that the chemical industry exerts a really large political influence, and there's been tons written about the lobbying and the doubt is their product and merchants of doubt, and those are absolutely terrific and valuable investigations. But we've gotten really, really curious about the scientific studies that have been coming for years from industry-supported or affiliated researchers that have come to very different and sometimes completely contradictory conclusions to studies about the same exact chemicals done by what we end up in the piece calling health effects researchers, as a kind of shorthand for sweeping in biologists, molecular biologists, endocrinologists, epidemiologists, the scientists whose work is based on direct observations, who look directly at the ways chemicals affect human, animal, environmental health. And what we very quickly discovered was a long history on the industry side of things, that there was this whole body of science that has been created that fits squarely into the camp of regulatory toxicology, science investigating the toxicity of chemicals, that is building a body of science that is being used in chemical regulation. And what we quickly found was these studies, lots and lots of them, or just hundreds of them, are based on the same kind of models, these physiologically based pharmacokinetic models. And that's a huge mouthful, but the simplest way to explain it, and I'm guessing there are plenty of people on the call who are already familiar with this idea, this concept, but for anyone who's not, really simply, these are computer models that are designed to produce estimates and representations of how much chemical is in a human or other animal body, how long it takes that chemical to move through the body, where it goes in the body, what tissues or cells or organs it interacts with. And that information is then correlated with potential health effects and some kind of estimation of how likely it is that a certain health effect could happen, comes out of that model. And that's really, really different than doing an experiment to figure out what happens to a mouse when it's exposed to bisphenol A, for example. Does it affect its reproductive system? Does it affect its neurological system? How does it interact with thyroid hormones? Those are really different kinds of questions that biologists are asking. So what we discovered is that, yes, indeed, there are two camps of scientists, and they fall really squarely into those researchers who are working with or for or somehow supported by industry, who are doing these modeling studies, and the non-industry affiliated researchers who are doing health effects research. And I know this is kind of a long answer, but it's a humongous question. It's basically our whole story premise. And the other really big bottom line on the PBPK studies, as they're known for short, the regulatory toxicology studies, is those kind of models, it turns out, have consistently, over the past 30 or more years, because this all goes back to the early 1980s, have been consistently used to downplay the hazards of chemicals, downplay the risks of chemical exposures, and also have been inserted and promoted in the regulatory process with the effect of delaying regulation of chemicals, sometimes literally for decades. And this doesn't answer the why unsafe products are on the shelf, but we could leave that for maybe later on.
Yeah, we'll get to that, I'm sure. But let's go back a little bit further to understand how the field of regulatory toxicology started. You know, you say that it has this strong industry influence. I'm wondering if you can discuss the origins of this field of science.
Yeah. I mean, what we did, and in researching this piece is, as I said, we got just really curious why it seemed to be that there was this bunch of researchers, and when we pulled out studies, and I frankly started looking at a bunch of recent studies on bisphenol A and got really curious why I was seeing certain researchers' names on bunches of studies that all came out and basically said, we don't really think there is much health risk here. We don't think this is much of a problem. And I just got really curious. So I did, an informal literature search, and I went back over time and I looked at who these researchers were, who the authors of these studies are, who they had worked with, and I started following things back kind of the way you would a family tree. And this took me back all the way to the 1980s and the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and Department of Defense Research Lab, where a bunch of scientists who had been given the task of looking at chemical toxicities for the Department of Defense for a whole array of chemicals the military were using, were developing these computer models. It was back at the time in the 1980s when desktop computers were just becoming available, so people had these tools at their disposal for the first time. It was also exactly the same point in time that the major U.S. environmental laws were being put into effect, and the chemical industry was being asked, really for the first time ever, to take responsibility for their toxic chemical emissions, for their hazardous waste, thinking of toxics reporting inventory, the TRI inventory, TSCA, Superfund, community right to know, all of these things. OSHA wasn't even that old at that time. All of these things were coming into play, and we actually found minutes from trade association meeting, actually the precursor to the American Chemistry Council, where people were going back and forth and saying, it's like, oh my gosh, we're going to be asked for this information. We better get a grip on it. And we've also found papers where people had used these PBPK models to look at ways of estimating exposures and risks, and they were doing this at one point for methylene chloride, and they explicitly said in a paper, we're really happy to report that our use of these models has effectively delayed EPA regulation of methylene chloride, because these are models, and you can maneuver them, manipulate them to get a certain kind of result. And it doesn't mean the model is wrong, but its results depend on what you put into it. And industry very quickly picked up on this and started commissioning these studies. So this has a long and consistent history. Again, a really long answer to a short question, but it's a big story.
No, that's totally fine. And you did touch on my next question a little bit in your answer, which is about the limitations of relying on PBPK models to assess chemicals. So can you just talk a little bit more about how they work and
Sure.
that you put certain inputs in and that's all that you can see
that
comes out? That was interesting.
Yeah, and I will say, for the story, we did dozens of interviews, and we talked to both biologists who really don't like the way things are going in terms of chemical regulation and how much attention health effects are being given politically. And we also talked to folks who work on these regulatory toxicology studies, and everybody was very frank about the fact that these are models, and what you get out depends on what you put in. The late Lou Gillette told my co-author Valerie Brown, junk in, junk out. I also talked to a really interesting researcher that I think you guys probably know named Leo Tresande, who is at NYU. And he said, well, they can be really useful. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. But all of the biologists really explained to us very clearly that one of the big limitations is, one, as Linda Birnbaum told us, they don't tell you anything about health effects as such because they're not observational studies. And two, they are usually designed very narrowly so that they focus on one particular chemical effect, one particular health effect at a time, when in fact most chemicals can produce an array of effects. So say if you're doing a PBPK study of formaldehyde, it won't tell you anything about the whole range of health effects that formaldehyde could possibly have. It'll look really, really narrowly at one thing, and that's one of the reasons they've ended up being really useful if you want to delay regulation, because you could say, hey, we have this whole study that shows you're going to produce, say in the case of formaldehyde, nasal tumors, but it doesn't look like you're going to get any leukemia effects. So they can be very, very narrowly focused, and for that reason have a lot of limitations when it comes to chemicals that may have subtler effects, may produce delayed effects, and things like that, particularly difficult if you want to assess endocrine or other hormone-disrupting chemicals, because a chemical that will produce sort of a change in function that can set the stage for a health effect that shows up years later, really hard to model in that way.
Right, and I hope we can talk more about EDCs later as well, since that is there's emerging scientific evidence about their effects. You also discussed the revolving door between industry-affiliated groups and federal regulators as one of the dynamics that contribute to the fact that deadly chemicals are on the market. How does the revolving door work? Who are the players? Who is revolving?
Well, I hope people, and if I had done slides, I would have made one of this really complicated spiderwebby chart we did for the story. And we did it on this huge piece of rolled out butcher paper because it was so huge. And revolving sounds sort of slow. It's almost like spinning, perpetually spinning door. And what we found was that people have moved over the years, and again, this goes back to the 1980s, even to the 1970s, from the early days of the EPA. People have moved from government agencies to industry or to industry-affiliated research institutions like what was originally called the Chemical Industry Institute of Toxicology, but was renamed to try and confuse people that it had anything to do with industry, to the Hamner Institute, as it's now called. Places like that, which get a lot of support from industry directly, but also get a lot of money in government contracts. People have also moved from government agencies to private consultancies, places with names that I'm sure some folks on the call are familiar with, like Exponent and Gradient and Toxic Excellence in Research Associates or something. It's TERA, I always get it wrong, that do lots and lots of work on industry contracts, but they also get government contracts. And this continues today, people moving back and forth between these groups. And on one hand, there really isn't anything wrong with people moving jobs, but it brings the influence with it. And what has happened as part of this back and forth is, because the EPA and other agencies do this, but we look primarily at EPA, because the EPA routinely contracts out, hires consulting groups, outside contractors, to assemble the panels, the committees, the review committees that it uses when it's evaluating chemicals for regulation. These contractors, which are often simultaneously working for industry, sometimes on the very same chemicals, also select the literature that they're going to review. And so we discovered that the people serving on these panels, the literature that's selected is heavily, heavily weighted towards these PBPK studies and towards industry influence. And this goes back to the earliest days of the EPA. So we have a long history of the science that's being considered in regulation and the people who are making these choices being heavily influenced by industry interests.
And obviously, a field of science that has been developed by industry and whose outcomes are largely determined by industry has profound implications for public health. In your article, you cite some specific chemicals that remain unregulated despite mounting evidence from the health effects researchers showing that they're harmful. Can you discuss one or two of these chemicals?
Yeah, sure. And I'll try to be brief because these things are like decades-long stories. One of the ones we picked out just because it was such a perfect illustration was methylene chloride, a solvent that is used as a paint and varnish stripper. And if you go to your local hardware store, you will find lots of products on the shelf that contain it, even though it is a potentially deadly neuro and respiratory toxin. And this was one of the chemicals that the researchers at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base looked at in the 1980s and said very explicitly in a paper that was published in 1987-88, hey, we've done this modeling for methylene chloride, and guess what? We've delayed EPA regulation. And if you look at the history of trying to regulate, the EPA trying to regulate methylene chloride, they still, there have been warnings issued by OSHA, by NIOSH. EPA has issued all sorts of rules, but the chemical is still out there in use. And guess what? If you look at the fine print on both the EPA rulemaking history and also what OSHA has in its rulemaking on methylene chloride, you will see that one of the primary studies that they are still relying on is this late 1980s PBPK study that was done by these very researchers at the DoD. You can follow similar history for formaldehyde. We saw things like this with trichloroethylene. Bisphenol A is a kind of different sort of chemical, but it's building a history like this as well. You can also see it in the realm of pesticides. And EPA has just started coming up with some different kinds of decision-making recently on pesticides like chlorpyrifos, but we saw the very heavy influence of PBPK studies in that as well. So there are lots and lots of examples.
And what happens when the PBPK studies contradict what actual biological experiments conclude? What do regulators do in this case?
The history that we've seen is deferring to the PBPK studies, and that's why, as we say at the beginning of the piece, scientists who are normally or usually historically very polite about disagreements, the folks on the biology, the health and endocrinology side of this are starting to get more than riled up, and there are papers going back and forth, there are letters going back and forth in scientific journals, and there've been scientific statement after scientific statement from people like the Endocrine Society and and quite a number of others saying you really have to pay attention to this research that we're doing, because if not, there are going to be even wider spread incidence of chronic diseases that are being associated with these chemical exposures.
Going back to something you touched on earlier, it seems that the emerging scientific evidence of how endocrine disrupting chemicals affect the body has brought the limitations of computer-based modeling into sharper focus. What are your thoughts on the future of chemicals policy related to EDCs?
Oh, that's an enormous question. And
you have some time to answer it.
The really simple answer is it already is, and it's going to be really, really difficult because really fundamentally, endocrine disrupting chemicals, their effects are on a time frame and on a kind of biological spectrum that's really different than regulating even a chemical like methylene chloride, where you're going to have an immediate acute adverse effect. Somebody breathes this thing in a confined space, they could and drop dead, as far too many people have. Exposure to an endocrine disrupting chemical doesn't work like that. You can't see something, you don't feel something, you don't smell something, but there may be subtle but really profound effects, profound changes in how hormones function. And again, these probably won't produce an immediate adverse effect, but it can set the stage, especially when these things happen, it seems, in prenatal exposures, for adverse health effects later in life. And these run the gamut from metabolic disorders like tendency towards obesity and diabetes, which can obviously set the stage for cardiovascular, circulatory diseases, can affect neurological function, and endocrine disruptors have been linked to lowered IQ and behavior problems in children. Obvious links to reproductive disorders, infertility, among others. They can also set the stage for certain cancers. And the thing that, as so many people on the call probably know, that makes this really difficult in terms of regulation is that you're not ever, with an endocrine disruptor, going to have the same kind of direct cause and immediately straight line cause and effect as you would say as the poor bathtub refinisher who breathed in the methylene chloride in that small room and, had an immediate adverse effect. It's on a very different time frame. And what the folks on the industry-influenced regulatory toxicology side of the divide are arguing, as they have done in many, many papers that are very easy to find, is that endocrine disruption on its own should not be considered as a health outcome, an adverse health outcome, because it doesn't have this breathe it in, you keel over, or you get dizzy, or something like that. They're trying to make that argument. And a lot of the biologists and endocrinology folks that we talked to for this piece are on obviously the other side of this divide, and quite a number of them worked on some reports for the World Health Organization, the UN's Environment Program over the past several years, doing big reports on endocrine disruption, and that has erupted into this almost vicious back and forth between the industry-affiliated regulatory toxicology folks and the endocrinologists, epidemiologists, molecular biologists on the other hand. And what the outcome of it is yet we don't know, because part of this battle is going on in the European regulatory framework, which I probably wouldn't completely pass the pop quiz on, but this is sort of hanging in the balance for some regulation in Europe. And just given the global marketplace, what happens in Europe or happens in the U.S. will affect what companies do worldwide, just because people do sell into the global marketplace. And the other part of this complication is endocrine disruption is very hard to represent in these PBPK type models. At least that's what the biologist told us. And it looks as if the modeler side, the industry-affiliated researcher side, is pushing for trying to cram endocrine disruptors into that model. And if you do that, the biology side of this argument is really afraid it will, again, downplay the profound effects of endocrine disruptors. So how this plays into policy is going to be really, really complicated. And the story, we don't know where it's going quite yet.
That's really interesting, because I was asking myself, well, is there a way to, revise the PBPK studies, or if they were, funded by different people looking for different, starting at a different point, would it be helpful? But it sounds like there's just a flaw in looking at something as complex as the effects of endocrine disrupting chemicals that can't really be looked at adequately using that model.
Well, that's what a lot of the biologists that we talked to said. And one of the other things we discovered in our investigation, which is going to influence this, is the fact that there are collaborative research agreements between the EPA and other government agencies and groups like the American Chemistry Council's Long Range Research Initiative and the Hamner Institute to do new chemical testing, not just that they've done this historically, but moving into the future. So there's a lot of concern on the health effects research side of things that we are going to be continuing and perpetuating this pattern of industry influence of the basic science that is going into the decision making. So that's part of the reason why it's gotten so heated, because the industry influence is still really, really strong.
Well, Lizzie, that kind of concludes the questions that I had about the article specifically. I have a few other questions for you, and I just want to remind all of our listeners that we'll have some time with Lizzie here to ask more questions, so please keep those in mind. We'll be starting with our discussion shortly. I was just wondering what your current interests and investigations might be. Like, what are you working on now? What can we expect next?
Well, I'm always working on, a bunch of sort of short, more reactive things. But I have been for a while, but there was this story we were told is the longest one in these times has ever published, and I hope that doesn't scare anybody off from reading it. It really isn't that long, but most magazines these days publish pretty short pieces. But even at its length, this was what was published was only the tip of the iceberg of what we found. And there's so many chemicals that have stories that relate to this. There are a couple that I'm not going to say them now because I don't want to, spoil what I'm working on, even for myself. But there's some very specific individual chemicals that have really sort of complicated stories that actually, if you were clever, you could make a screenplay out of them for some kind of thriller. And I'd also I want to, see what the next chapter is in this. And I'm just really fascinated by pulling these things out. And sort of on another realm entirely, I finished up my last book thinking, oh my gosh, I wish I'd written more about occupational exposures. So I'm always working on stories about those. And I did a piece it's not last year, it was the beginning of this year, for NCIA, ended up being called What Are We Doing to Our Children's Brains?, looking at environmental exposure's effect on children's neurological development. And I just found that research, not my research, but the scientific research that I wrote about, so fascinating that I really would like to go back and look at other aspects of it. And I just did a couple of short pieces, one for Civil Eats and one for In These Times online, on some reports and research that was done looking at the effects of childhood hunger and food insecurity on children's health and development. And a lot of that was looking at effects of food insecurity, whether it's the nutritional effects or the stress-related physiological effects on children's neurological development. So I'm planning to try to write some more about that because it seems really, really important to me. And frankly, after I got finished with the pieces about food insecurity and children's health, I kept wondering, why is this not on the front page of every newspaper or in the headlines every day? Because I was just so appalled at the statistics and what the researchers were finding.
Well, we really look forward to your next piece, whether that be a book or article. So keep up all of the wonderful work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Your article was long, but it was so compelling. I thought, I could keep scrolling down, but it's great, and it's not surprising to know that it's just a piece of the story. So is there anything else that we didn't touch on that you'd like to discuss now before we move on to questions from our listeners?
I think the only thing in the story that we didn't talk about now, which was a huge piece of the research and just ended up almost being glanced on in the story because it was kind of hard to cram into the narrative, was the money involved. And we spent a huge amount of time digging this out of document files one way or another. And what we discovered is that millions, hundreds of millions of federal money, taxpayer money, has gone out in grants and contracts to industry supported or industry affiliated research institutes like the Hamner, and there are a couple others like that out there, or to these contractors who mostly work for industry. And it is so we've got taxpayer money that is funding research that basically has been supporting, it doesn't have to, but historically has been supporting chemical industry interests. And the amount of money is it's just staggering. We were able to pretty clearly account for almost $200 million, but we're pretty sure there's more out there. It's just really hard to pull these documents out of the file and line them all up. But yeah, the amount of money is phenomenal that's been involved.
Okay, well, great. Maybe that will be another article we can look forward to. You have a lot on your plate. Now we'd like to invite questions and comments from our listeners. So if you'd like to ask a question, please press *2 to unmute your line. Please also state your name and affiliation. And we have about 20 minutes for our discussion. So now is the time.
Hi, Diana. This is Pam with Alaska Community Action on Toxics, and I just want to thank you, Lizzie, so much for doing this and being with us and sharing your insights, and always enjoy reading your articles and your books. I just wanted to start us off with a question. Your article ends really with a level of frustration, I think, expressed by the scientists. And I think those of us who work in the realms of science and policy really feel a lot of frustration at this point, knowing what the consequences are in terms of public health and seeing the increasing links, as you point out, between disorders and diseases and exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals. So I guess I just wanted to get your sense, and Patricia Hunt says that if we wait for proof in the form of compelling human data, it may be too late for us as a species. I think that really sums things up. So I just wanted to get your sense of, how do we really take this evidence to the policymakers and make the case for compelling and urgent need for change based on the current state of scientific evidence?
Yeah, well, thank you for that, and thanks so much for being on the call, and thank you for all your help with information and everything else. The level of frustration that we heard from these biologists, health effects research, was phenomenal. To have Pat Hunt say something like that, to have someone like Bruce Blumberg at University of California, Irving saying, I think we need to take the fight to the people, that's pretty extraordinary. And again, these scientific societies, Endocrine Society, very staid, old. I think it's one of the oldest scientific societies in the country, if not the oldest, coming out with statement after statement saying we have to pay attention to these things. It's an urgent matter of public health. I think what these scientists are starting to see, or they have seen, not even starting, is that they can't hold back the way they've been trained to and stay out of policy. Is they're going to have to get involved probably in the way the climate scientists have gotten involved. And that's a pretty big ask for scientists because they don't usually do that. And right now, the chemical industry has obviously got the upper hand when it comes to bending the ear of policymakers. And, I'm not, it'd be really fun. I don't make policy, but clearly the folks with this scientific information are going to have to get even better than they're starting to get at making sure that this is at the top of the pile or the last thing a legislator hears before they go make a vote. I'm not I'm not a lobbyist. I don't know exactly how you make that happen, but I think something like that is going to have to happen. And if you talk long enough to some scientists, they'll come around and say campaign finance reform. That's the only thing that's going to fix it. So some of the fixes are way out of the realm of science and public health, but getting the scientists into the mix is clearly what's going to have to happen.
Thank you, Lizzie. Are there other questions from people? Just remember, you press *2 to unmute your line. Don't be shy.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, this is Becky Wong, and I'm with Alaska Survival. I'm a supporter of ACAT. And this is more a comment. It's just, on all these issues that you all have been talking about, and pesticide issues, and that I've been involved with, one of the problems for citizen activists to affect policy is to be able to boil down to talking points, these scientific, the whole science and technology behind pesticides is very complicated. And Pam Miller has been really great at doing that and being a spokesperson all over the state. And people like me, I can never remember all this technological, scientific, chemical stuff, and I get real frustrated. So that's just more of a comment.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we learned writing this piece sort of on that side of things was we were working with a publication, which is terrific publication, used to doing all sorts of politics, very progressive, but they don't usually do science, and they certainly don't talk about chemicals a lot. So we had a really great and interesting time figuring out how you make this really complicated science, or what could be really complicated science, and a long, complex history, how you make that accessible, how you make it persuasive without actually ever having to dumb it down, so to speak. And I think that's for one of the reasons I've gotten so interested in, and I'm writing about effects on children's health, and one of the reasons I've ended up recently doing a lot of writing for a publication called Civil Eats that focuses on food policy issues. And I thought, oh gosh, I'm not going to write about food. It's so trendy. Everybody's writing about food. And then all of a sudden it dawned on me, everybody eats. People care about food. This is a way to talk to people about these chemical, or write for people about these chemical issues. And people pay attention. And I think the same thing on children's health. And I also think that's why so many of the state chemical laws, have gone into effect and been passed, and why this has become such an issue in thinking about the Toxic Substance Control Act, because when it becomes personal, whether it's kids or food, and you make the case to a local legislator, they get it on that level. And it's not, again, talking down, but it's quick. Why does this matter to me? And I think, I have to remember that all the time. Editors ask me that all the time. Why does this matter to our readers? What's the takeaway for our readers? And that seems really simple and kind of, jargony, the takeaway, but it turns out to be really important. People want to leave the 15 minutes they've spent with you with something that's going to matter to them. And I think that's, whether you're writing about it or trying to persuade your state representative, I think that's really important. And you can boil these things down in a way that makes it matter without oversimplifying it.
Thank you for your comment, Becky. Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question or make a comment? *2 to unmute your line, and then when you are done, if you could please press *2 again to mute your line.
Yeah, this is Steve Seymour, and I'm from Cape Cod in a group called Green Cape.
Hi.
Hi, how are you? Yeah, I thought I would jump in. We've been watching this kind of thing for quite a while and coming to some of the same conclusions you have, with how it's stacked against us and stuff. And we live on, I don't know if you know much about Cape Cod, but we drink the water underneath us. And we keep, ever since I've been down here for about 30 years, it's just like one pollutant after another. And the latest are the perfluorinated ones, the PFOS and the PFOA and stuff. And how do and we've been trying to find ways to talk, and this is a good talking point. It's actually probably a pretty good case study in some regards. But because some of the politicians just kind of don't get it, because it is kind of so complicated. I'm thinking of our state, no, our national rep here, in particular. He seems to be kind of obtuse to it. And we speak out wherever we can, and we even think that the state should be, because we've been preempted around a lot of the pesticides and controls, our Department of Health, and that they need to be looking at this in a much broader perspective, because what's the next shoe that's going to drop? And the sad part, and I don't want to go on too long, but people have probably been drinking this stuff in Hyannis, Massachusetts, probably for decades, until it got discovered by Silent Spring to when they did some testing for it. And now some action's being taken, but this stuff has like 100-year half-lives in the groundwater and stuff. So it's going to be a long time before it works through our system. So anyway, I'm just regurgitating all that on you, and it might be a good article.
Yeah, I don't know Hyannis really well, but I learned to swim in Wellfleet, so I do know the Cape. And yeah, I mean, these things do last forever, or a lot of them do last for a really, really long time. And, again, trying to make those connections really clear to people and figuring out how you present the health effects in a way that they don't get brushed off and have someone say, yeah, we've been drinking this stuff for 40 years and we're all still here. I mean, it is a heavy lift, I think, to make people pay attention, but the evidence is, there's tons of science there. So you've got a lot of work to do, but good luck with it.
We have time probably for one or two more questions, if there's anyone else out there who would like to join the conversation. *2 will unmute your line.
Well, and I guess the other thing I would add for Steve on the Cape is there is an enormous wealth of scientific expertise in the state of Massachusetts, not that far from you. Get in touch with some of these scientists. Have them come to your local meetings with whether it's the community or your representatives. They're really impressive, and I don't know if they'd be willing to do that, but that might be what I'd do.
Thanks, Lizzie. And I'm not seeing any other questions, and I know it's a busy time of year, so we might just end early. I guess I would like to give you an opportunity to say anything else if you would like to. And it looks like maybe we have one more question. Do we have one more question?
Yes, Diana. Hi, this is Pam again.
Yeah.
I guess I'd love to ask Lizzie your observations, I guess, about the problem of regrettable substitutions, and I think that's one of the most difficult challenges that we wrestle with is that when a certain molecule is phased out through regulation, like BPA, then we get BPS or some other substitute, and we've seen that with the huge proliferation of different flame retardants. And Steve raised the question about PFOA and PFOS, and now we're seeing a whole range of perfluorinated substances in the market to replace those chemicals. So I'd just be very interested to hear your thoughts on that very...
Oh, yeah. I mean, that to me is one of the most appalling sort of trajectories that we've been on. And I mean, there's so many ways that one needs to go about changing that. We can't regulate chemicals one at a time, essentially by their chemical registration numbers. So if you've got one thing that's been dinged somehow in regulation, you're like, oh, we'll just tweak it a little bit. We'll go out with a new thing, which is basically what's happened. We need people inventing truly safer chemicals. That trajectory is way too slow. And in the meantime, we need more of those regulations. So some of the language that's gotten into a few state bills that says, okay, if you take this flame retardant off the market, you cannot replace it with anything that is XYZ in effects, rather, so that you don't just say, hey, we took off PBDE1 and we're going to replace it with PBDE2. So yeah, I think that's huge. And virtually every time I write a piece about a different chemical, I'm working on something now, which is it's entirely about regrettable substitutions. Okay, we took this really toxic thing off the market, and guess what? The thing everybody's replaced it with, not much better. So yeah, that is just absolutely enormous. And the only other thing I wanted to say is that I am so grateful to everybody at ACAT and everybody else in Alaska who's been so generous with their time and helping me get to see some of what's going on in communities around the state. And I got to spend about 3 weeks there last year for a really big piece I did on climate change and food security. And honestly, I keep trying to think, okay, I need to do another piece so I can have an excuse to come back to Alaska, because it's such a fascinating place, and I couldn't have done any of the stories or reporting I've done from Alaska without the help of various groups around the state, and especially ACAT, because it's just such a special place, and you really need those personal introductions and extra help. So I just wanted to thank you guys again and again for being so generous.
Well, thank you, Lizzie, and I think I speak for everyone at ACAT in thanking you for your interest in our environmental health concerns and for everything that you're doing. And I think this might be a great time for me to mention our next call, because it is going to be on Wednesday, January 13th, with Ken Geiser, and he'll be discussing his new book, Chemicals Without Harm, Policies for a Sustainable World, in which he proposes a different strategy for protecting public health, which is exactly what we were talking about, to develop and adopt safer alternatives to hazardous chemicals rather than focus exclusively on controlling them, because when we're just trying to control them, we have that problem of regrettable substitution. So we hope you'll be able to join us in the new year, and you can sign up now on our website at akaction.org. Finally, as this year draws to close, I hope you'll consider making a year-end donation to Alaska Community Action on Toxics to support our Che Alaska calls. Your contribution will help us continue to bring you a great lineup of authors, scientists, medical professionals, and activists each and every month next year. You can donate online at akaction.org. Also want to remind everyone that a recording of this call will be available on our website later this week, and we'll let you know when that is ready. And if you have any additional questions or comments, please feel free to contact us. Our phone number is 907-222-7714. You can also contact me by email at diana@akaction.org. And thanks again to each and every one of you. Have a healthy and a happy holiday season, and we look forward to having you on the line next year. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.